Welcome. And it's some bright-eyed and bushy-tailed folks tuning into Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thank you for joining us and being in the waiting room so patiently. We had some people in the waiting room for half an hour, so for those that were waiting, I hope you had some coffee ready. Maybe a little Grey Goose martini for the morning to wake you up.
We're on gallery view for a second. You can see everybody.
Yeah, so we have a really, really great seminar today. We'll still wait for a few people to join. So we have a good number of people registered, and if we all know bartenders, we all know we're late. So we're gonna just give a few minutes, and if you want to jot down in the chat where you're tuning in from, maybe your bar or your city or your province or your state or your country, we're welcoming you all in to Nova Scotia's kitchen today. In our case, we're in downtown Dartmouth, actually. So the baby sister city to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we're Drink Atlantic. So this is my business partner, Jeff. I'm Matt. We run the Clever Barkeep here in Nova Scotia. And we have a great group of friends that help us activate this. One being someone that is going to be speaking today, and Christina. Evan McNeil, you can see at the top of your screen, Stefan Duval, John Smolensky, Ezra Edelstein, and then of course Jeff and myself. So this is year 3 for Drink Atlantic, and we were very close to not having it happen, but all of these friends that have helped us execute this kind of pushed us up and said, you know, let's make sure that we're still alive this year and in the minds of people. So we quickly pivoted to giving this information away for free. Trying to reach as many people as possible so that you know about Drink Atlantic. We can stay engaged with each other, and we can welcome you to Halifax next year. For those of you that haven't been to Halifax, it's a port city on the east coast of Canada, and it's known for its hospitality. It was built on rum. Our people are very, very interested in other people and are very polite. Think of like when you travel to a country and you're like, does this person want money because they're being really nice to me? But really they just want to know more about where you're from, and they want to invite you into their home. One thing that we do here a lot is kitchen parties. Seem to gravitate towards there either because of food or because the oven's on and it keeps the place warm. But that's what we do here in Halifax. So we want to welcome you to Drink Atlantic. Obviously this year we can't be on the ground, and we're sad to see that, but when the borders open up in the next year, we're going to invite all of you to come and hang out. So it's the premier cocktail festival in Atlantic Canada, and we're kind of highlighting our industry professionals, but also bringing industry leaders and speakers to our country and to our province to celebrate together with different events, and branded dinners and seminars, and education is at the core of what we do. So we're really, really excited to have you all here today. And it would not be possible without the support from the NSLC, which is our provincial liquor control board. WSET, the Wine Spirits Education Trust, has been a great supporter of what we've been doing. The CPBA, which you have a couple representatives, including one of your speakers, Kevin Brownlee, today, that have been awesome for the bartending community in Canada. And then our key sponsor that's made this seminar possible is Grey Goose. And Mama Goose, Steph Lamb, thank you so much. I know she'll be here. Thank you for all that you do in making this seminar possible. So the speakers today, really, really excited because they're both very good friends of ours, and they're just awesome at doing everything that they do. They're kind of leading voices, in my opinion, in our country. So starting with Kevin, near and dear friend of mine, is Bacardi's Vancouver-based portfolio ambassador who's spent more than 10 years working behind the stick and in the restaurant industry from Winnipeg to Vancouver. Before settling into the brand role on the west coast of Canada, he competed in various competitions, led bar teams, and managed operations for successful businesses. He's a vocal community leader and one of the directors of the CPBA. So Kevin has dedicated a decade working in behavioral development programming with public education prior to making the decision to pursue a career in hospitality, which has welcomed him with open arms. So we're very fortunate. He's also got a really sweet jump shot. So if you ever want to need the guy that's just going to get in and do all the dirty work in a basketball game, Kevin's your guy. Thanks for being there, Kevin.
Thank you for that glowing introduction. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm very much looking forward to speaking with you all from out here in Vancouver, and speaking and supporting with my good friend Christina Veira, who's really put together quite an incredible seminar today. So this is it's exciting. I don't need to take too much time right now. I'll just pass it back to you, my man.
Yeah, and Lord knows I'm wordy. So if you guys ever
it's not all jump shots. You got to make some assists from time to time, right?
Yeah. Well, Steve Nash is from out there. So Christina Veira, lovely to see you. Chosen as one of Imbibe's magazine, Imbibe 75, one of the people, places, and directions that will shape the way you drink in 2019. I think that's a lie. It's going to be 2020. It's going to be all through to 2030. If you don't know Christina, there's something wrong. You haven't been in the industry long enough. Most recently, she curated the bar and beverage pavilion at Restaurants Canada Show and Speed Rack Canada seasons 3 and 4, and would have been 5 here in Nova Scotia, but we'll make sure we have her back next year. And in 2019 was selected by WSET and IWSC as one of the 50 under 40 future influencers of the global drinks industry. So kind of like a big deal. She has occupied every front of house position and a couple in the kitchen while pursuing certifications in wine and beer, even winning a cocktail competition here and there. When not consulting on beverage programs, her focus is on industry education, event execution, and using the hospitality industry as a catalyst for community engagement and fundraising. I got the pleasure to meet Christina last year when she came to Drink Atlantic, and she came as someone just, to help to put on a seminar. But then she became much more than that. She became kind of like a program guide, a very gracious consultant while Jeff and I were up to our eyes and trying to execute events, and just like offered all of this help, and was just like such a help. And when we were thinking about this year, there's, the top of our list was Christina to help us execute Drink Atlantic. So we're very fortunate to have her here today. The way the format's going to go, we're going to do a little bit of presentation, about an hour, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And what we'd love for the group is if you're, tuning in from a place that has already been open during the pandemic, or, has a longer, everywhere's opening at different rates, right? So in Nova Scotia, we've been open for about a week, whereas BC, it's a couple weeks. There's places in the States, I'm sure we have people on that have been open for longer. So some experience shares that are going to help the group. What have you seen successful? How have you seen people respond to opening? And these conversations, like if you have an experience share, don't be afraid to put it in there. Use the chat function for your questions in the Q&A, and John Smolensky will be monitoring that for us. Thank you, John. So with no further ado, I'd like to just pass it off to Christina to get us started. And I hope you all have a Grey Goose Martini or Le Grand Fizz, or however you need in front of you to get this party started. So cheers to you, and thank you for being here.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning to some of you and afternoon to the rest. I really appreciate everyone being here today with Kevin and I. I'm going to share my screen, but I just want to do a little bit of a background on what this actually is. It's a 2-part seminar. I was really excited when speaking to the guys in Drink Atlantic, the whole Drink Atlantic team, a few months ago, to be honest, especially about a month ago, that they were on board for this seminar. So as a little brief background as to why this is even important to me is, I guess I started in hospitality in around first year. So I guess 15 years ago. And I very quickly almost always had some sort of management role or responsibilities. But one thing that became really obvious, especially in Canadian hospitality, is there's just not a lot of training for management, to be honest. Usually you are great with guests, or you are great at making drinks, and then you become a manager. And then, but the actual things that you need in order to thrive as a manager, be it cost management or managing people are not things that are not the same skill set as being nice at a table and punching in something accurately. It shouldn't be that you get one so you're good at the other. When I started in Toronto, it definitely was like a little bit more Wild West in terms of how places were. Definitely was a lot more obviously abusive than what people are used to now in our places. But even now, it's become very obvious that there's a lot of those softer skills and like what we think of softer, but are actually very real skills, that those leadership and actual management skills that are lost in the mix. A lot of what we're actually told and how to think about our staff, if you are a manager, is almost combative. It's like the staff are the people who get in the way of your goal as a manager, when that's actually not very true. You can't really do anything if your staff aren't on side, if your staff don't understand your business plan. So seeing how everything was going with quarantine, actually even 3 months ago, I, while spiraling at home, definitely became a lot more concerned about what our Re-Open would actually look like. Would we just do what we tend to do in hospitality, which is just say we're just going to do it, not even really reflect on it, and just put our heads down and actually promote a lot of the same toxic attitudes that we had before, but now we're making less money and we have more rules and we're a lot more stressed. So this 2-part series is, I will say, going to be very dense. It's not going to give you a lot of answers, and it's designed that way. The idea is that we want to start, or I would love if we could all start shifting how we think about our jobs, how we think about our roles, and how we interact with each other. And that will look different for different people in different spaces, but there will be some through lines. One thing that I do believe in too is this idea of this idea that you can use empathy as a grounding principle to make good business decisions, especially because we talk a lot about being hospitable, and we can often be hospitable towards our guests, but maybe we're not hospitable towards each other in our workspaces, towards our suppliers and all of that. And it's almost hypocritical that we will be the first to talk about community and hospitality when a magazine calls us, but then we don't actually embody that with how we like work with each other in our own spaces. So that's just the precursor. I don't know if Kevin, you have anything to add before I attempt to share the screen and we start to go through the slides. Oh, you muted, baby.
There we go. Yeah, and in that with leadership, it's that how is leadership defined, because it isn't ever about one individual who's leading the ship. It's about how they can interact with their people to create that space so that the operation can succeed, and in that it's going to take a lot of dialogue moving forward, because you're going to be managing expectations when everyone will have gone through something in these last 3 months that we don't know unless we ask where they're at and what they're going through. And that leadership is really going to be paramount to driving that success. So yeah, I'll be chiming in like that from time to time.
Perfect. So there's 2 parts. This is week 1. Next week is week 2. Today we'll be talking a bit more about pre-open. Next week will be more the first few days. Obviously, there are some things that will carry over between the 2. We'll probably some of the topics, we'll dip our toes into next week's topics, but just that is the loose structure for what we'll be talking about today. So, everyone can see it, thumbs up. All right, perfect. So, Bar Manager Bootcamp. Oh, will it let me do it? There we go. Have to click it. All right. So the first thing, and I kind of touched on that in that intro, is this idea of rethinking what a reopen is. To call it a reopen, and especially it did look like this probably about 3 months ago to a lot of people, like we would have this temporary shutdown, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, and then we'll just pick up back where we left off. In almost every, or I guess actually every jurisdiction that is reopening in Canada, and if anyone's in the States, definitely in the States, there's a lot more rules that are on in terms of capacity, in terms of your ability to sell alcohol, in terms of safety measures, in terms of what you can do. For example, in Toronto, We are not in Reopen yet. We should be by July, but live music and loud music without any kind of decibels added to that are not allowed in restaurants or bars. So for many people, for many bars, for many restaurants, that actually involves a complete rethinking of what your actual space would be. So to call it a reopen would almost be to do yourself a disservice, because for most people, you're actually not reopening the bar you had. You are very much likely creating a new bar and opening that. Sometimes that'll be huge changes. For some of you, maybe you already did a lot of your business through takeout, so it's actually just more of a shift, but it still is more opening a new concept than reopening what you did before. I say this because language, and there's tons of studies about this, but language actually is something that you can use to help change your mentality and to help for your mental health. If you think of it as like it's back to normal, it's a reopen, same sales goals, or like just scale it by half, you'll do yourself a disservice. And then the one thing too that we should talk about, and a couple people here have been in I do a weekly In My Feelings group where people can literally just come into Zoom and talk about their feelings. One thing, and if you talk to counselors and social workers and people who work more in those fields, even before the last 3 weeks or so of heightened awareness about racial injustice, we were still in a pandemic, and we're still in a pandemic. We're about 3 months in, with a lot of jurisdictions around the world still being in lockdown or just coming out of it. When we talk about we throw around the words pandemic and quarantine, and they're very heavy words, and now they almost become numb to us, but it's actually very realistic to think about it as a shared trauma. Just because you personally didn't lose, say, a loved one, or you didn't actually get sick, doesn't mean it didn't affect you. For the whole world, or for everyone you know, to have restricted movement for 3 months is significant. For most people you know to have a significant drop in their income, or maybe lose their businesses, is a significant trauma. It's actually something that you can, for once, assume that everyone that you interact with has been affected by, even if it's lighter for some than others. And knowing that the reason why you're opening something isn't just because you had to close and you had to open, but something that is also a function of this like shared global trauma sounds intense. It almost sounds dramatic, but actually will help you shift your mentality into what you're doing. It'll also help you just be easier on yourself on what this reopen looks like, because it's not, a lot of us in hospitality are very solutions based and very goal based. And we want to open and we want everything to be perfect. And we get frustrated with it. Even now I talk to my friends who are already in the middle of an open, and the frustration that they have had for things not going smoothly, not even necessarily being able to find bicycle bags to do delivery, has also been a frustration that is born out of still acting like everything is normal rather than acting like you're responding to like a traumatic event and using new solutions. So I just wanted to say that the basis of this conversation is that we're going to rethink what we are actually talking about with the reopen. Kevin, anything to add there?
Yeah, and so much of that is about staying informed with what is going to be allowed legally in your province or city. Every market is going to operate a little bit differently based on provincial guidelines. The federal mandates for spacing and things like that are going to be pretty ubiquitous, but make sure that you're speaking out to the right people in your community that can help provide the answers for you, that are going to help you understand what it's going to take to relaunch your business, because that's very much what this is.
Mm-hmm. When you create a business plan, I don't know, and I do understand that many people in this chat are bar managers that don't have the autonomy to actually create the full business plan. But when you do that, there's a lot that's involved in that. It's not just getting a space and opening it up and making a bar menu. Like, you actually do choose what your floor plan will look like. You do choose what equipment will go in there. You do think about the mechanics of your staff and your guests. All those things that you've already decided will be changed, not because of anything that you wanted, but also just because of legislations. So acknowledging that you will probably have to change your plan because of that, and you can't necessarily do your original plan because your floor plan isn't going to flow the same, your staff can't flow the same, is significant and important. Right. The other thing that we want to do, and what is important throughout the whole reopen, not only in the beginning days, but going forward, is I think it's worthwhile that we try to center safety and stability. And right now, the most tangible part of safety is, of course, physical safety. That's what we see a lot on the news. Wear a mask, wear gloves, and change them often, physically distance from people for 6 feet. As I mentioned, it is helpful even to think about this the past few months as a shared trauma. Mental safety will be important, emotional safety, and financial safety and stability. That's for you, all of those. That's also for your staff, and it's also for your guests. Knowing that a lot of, understanding that in order to keep your staff safe and you safe and your guests safe, that you'll probably have to center these in a way that you didn't do in your business plan before, will help you have a more successful open, because it'll help you avoid a lot of those issues, especially interpersonal issues, that are really what gum up everything. You can have a beautiful menu, but if your staff are beefing, or if your guests just don't understand it and they're frustrated by how they have to give a phone number when they come in, or they're frustrated at the different rules you're putting on them, that overall will not lead to a good open. It's also just something that as a society, we probably haven't centered enough in our spaces, even though we cater to people. Thinking about if we're making something safe for someone's mental health, and that could just be in terms of what the shifts look like and what jobs they have to do. If we're being emotionally safe, are we telling our staff that from now on the customer is always right, and because we just need the sales, and we are essentially putting an expectation on our staff that we want them to put up with more shit or abuse as a result of our lower sales? That's not great. Are we also recognizing that even though the business might be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, your staff probably also have gone through a deep period of financial insecurity and might also have trust issues regarding their shifts, you and guests, especially if they're in roles that rely heavily on tips. And understanding that some of especially trauma and crisis, doesn't necessarily look like what we think it's going to look like. It doesn't always look like people crying. It can look like people being very angry. So understanding that maybe your staff understands intellectually that you cut them 2 hours early today, but they just went through a period of the last 3 months where they felt blindsided by not having a job, and they're mad about those 2 hours, but they're not really mad about those 2 hours. And they're feeling unsafe, not because they needed theoretically $28. It's this whole period of financial safety and stability, and being able to ground your decisions in an understanding of how those decisions will affect these different styles of safety will help you going forward. And I know this sounds very touchy-feely, but parts of this is also what makes you a great a great leader, and also helps people that you have to lead invest in you going forward. If they know that you're centering it, even if you have to make hard decisions, they're more likely to work alongside you.
Mm-hmm. And having and working it's going to start within, it's going to all start in-house, right? Managing the expectations of your staff and understanding where they're at so that you can provide them with tools and techniques to de-escalate situations when people come into the restaurant. I think the biggest challenge is that everyone in here knows once those doors are open and people come in, all bets are off. We want to give people the benefit of the doubt that they're going to respect these physical guidelines, that they're going to understand that they're there to have an experience. But at the same time, you just never know who's coming in the door. And so having, the ability to recognize where people are at before even having to ask them, and then monitoring that over the course of the experience of the dining or the bar restaurant thing is going to be so paramount to the growth. What that looks like.
And it varies from region to region, but in the first week of Oklahoma being open, granted it was Cinco de Mayo, but there's a large bar restaurant space that was essentially overrun with people trying to get in. We're not happy that they were being limited from entering the place because of the capacity laws, and basically pushed past the staff, and they ended up calling police to help deal with the issue. That's an extreme version. I'm not saying that you're going to open and that your staff are going to be physically assaulted. But what I am saying is, regardless of what that actually looked like in the extreme, part of that is because we can say whatever we want to our guests, but how many of us had guests sitting at tables and we'd ask them to just wait for their server to come over instead of go up to the bar to order, and they'll continually go up to the bar to order. This idea that we'll put in rules and everyone will just go along with them ignores what actual human behavior looks like. So putting in different steps and thinking about this, even the lifespan of your guest, of your staff, of yourself, while implementing those rules, and especially thinking about the different kinds of safety and stability, will be helpful. Okay, so your first step is to reassess your business plan. And this is very loaded depending on your role and who you are and what you can do. But the biggest thing is, what do you want it to be? And of course, you can think about the place that you were before, right? So you just want, like, what do you want? But then the second one, as Kevin mentioned before, especially knowing your municipal or regional rules, is like, what can it be? If you are a bar that specializes in live music in downtown Toronto, you cannot specialize in live music in phase 2, which means that you necessarily have to change your business plan. And what you could do is kind of be like, well, just kind of throw your hands up and not engage. But there are different things that you could maybe play around with, you can experiment with. Maybe small programs that once the restrictions are loosened, you can actually facilitate more. That's why you know some bars and restaurants have played around with grocery programs, right? Or takeout for certain aspects that people weren't interested in before, but now everyone eats at home. And they're actually a little bit more interested in maybe certain preserved fish and meat that they wouldn't have purchased. A lot of these bars and restaurants can still continue to do that going forward because they've now built up that business model in a way that wouldn't have been sustainable in the past. And that's what you can work around. But one thing that will be helpful is you don't tell yourself that you're opening like a whack bar or a worse version of what you did. But if you're opening a different version of what you did, or a different bar altogether. If you tell yourself this is a worse version of what your dream is, it's going to be a worse version of what your dream is. There's only so much emotional capacity you'll be putting into actually making it successful. If you're waiting for the phase where everything is open post-vaccine, we don't know when that's going to happen. So your ability to create something that gives you joy and professional satisfaction right now will be good, not only just for your work life, but also for your mental health and your staff's mental health. It'll give them something that they also can understand, rather than opening something that's always in this waiting period that you don't know when it's going to come. And you might actually stumble upon, sorry, I live in Toronto, so there's all the sirens. You might actually stumble upon a better business model, something that is healthier for people.
I think one thing to add to that is, you know, every brand has every bar, restaurant, and their brand has an identity. And it's going to be very important for those owners and managers to still feel like the brand belongs to them, right? There are going to be adaptations and changes that need to take place moving forward, especially when it comes to the physical space inside the bar or restaurant. But it's important to maintain the integrity and the identity of that brand, because that's what your guests know. That's what your guests love and feel about the place that they're going to. So finding a way to create that and have that framework in place so that when people come in, it still feels like bar A, bar B, you know? And so that's something to note for sure, that your team, that's going to come down, I think, more to ownership and how they're able to, you know, make the spends that they need to create that physical spacing inside the venues themselves. But making sure that you're maintaining that identity is so important. And, you know, just throwing up a bunch of plexiglass everywhere, while that might be the guideline to separate people, does that fit the identity of what you're trying to do with your bar, or what your bar looked like before? And if the answer is no, then you have to perhaps reframe what it is that you're going to look at and how you're going to consider creating these physical spaces so that you can adhere to the guidelines while still maintaining the identity.
I'd also say don't be overwhelmed by the rules and guidelines to the extent that you're not engaging with what is discretionary and what is mandatory. A lot of jurisdictions, plexiglass isn't mandatory if you have certain other approaches to distancing. Some of them, you don't actually have to spend the money on gloves as long as your staff are washing their hands often. Some of them you are allowed to lean over, and you can instruct your staff on how to make sure that when they're leaning, they're not bending over all the way. And you can go about it that way. Don't just look at the giant list of potential guidelines and think you have to do everything and then get overwhelmed with what that will look like, that you're always able to engage with the guidelines in a way that is safe and in the spirit of them, but also in a way that can still have some sort of identity for you. Like, and not everything is the worst. Like in a lot of places throughout Canada, I know, and I think in the States, there's been an expansion of patios and how we engage with patio space and outdoor space. So you can look at it like, I can't have as many people inside, but you can also look at it as this almost challenge where if we're able to expand outside in interesting ways, what does it look like if I had more of an outdoor program than I was able to have in years past, because the licensing has been loosened up. There are some things that could be good for your business overall and good to play around in for your programming.
Christina, if I may, just a share from Nova Scotia from a bar that I saw here. So the guideline is around, you need to have a barrier, say at the bar, that is wipeable. That doesn't mean that you must have plexiglass. So this bar in Dartmouth actually put up old French kind of doors with windows in them. And it was really cool. And it was, they were able to open the doors to serve the drink and then close it, be able to wipe it. It was interesting way of thinking about, like, we don't have to be married to plexiglass if the regulation is that it's a wipeable surface. So I think to just go along with what you guys are saying, thinking outside of the box and being able to stay true to your brand is going to take some thought from us. Yeah. It's not going to be easy, and
it's going to be, there's no playbook on this, right? There's no framework for what's going to drive success and what isn't. So there's going to be some trial and error. It's important to be open to that critical feedback, I think, too, for management, from staff, from owners. People are just trying to put their best foot forward and do so respectfully. And there's going to be some hiccups, but that's, we've just gone through a major trauma, and so hopefully we can kind of get through that.
And bear in mind too, our industry is full of alarmist people who don't actually read things throughout. Like, we know that about, even when you go to different regions, you'll listen to like 5 owners talk about the same liquor law that has not changed for 30 years and give you a different take on it. It's always worthwhile not to necessarily look at that Facebook post where they're like, you only have to do like plexiglass everywhere and like no one will be able to talk to people, and even guests at the same table have to be 6 feet away, and actually just read it yourself. Look at it critically. And if you want, you can also just do what other industries are like more willing to do often. Like, you can ask a city councillor, you can call Toronto Public Health, you can ask your BIA. If something doesn't make sense to you, like using a BIA can be really helpful for that. And those are things that, like, I think retail industries and other industries have been a little bit better at. And in bars and restaurants, especially, we can be very hands off and try to be outside the rules. This is a good time to try to engage with what the rules actually are and see if there's ways you can use them to your advantage. The other thing is, in that you want to reassess your business plan, part and parcel of that is reassessing your working culture. So there's this idea, especially in media, that restaurants are basically a conversation between owners and guests. And that's not what they are. It's not that like an owner creates X and then a guest comes in and that's what happens. Staff are incredibly necessary to a hospitality conversation. Their engagement is necessary. Their ability to engage with what the actual objectives of the role are, their ability to be actually excited about it, and for them to actually facilitate the sales. There's very few restaurants or bars that can exist that don't have staff that engage with what the actual culture is. There will be more stress for most places. Many places will have fewer jobs available. They might have less guests. A lot of guests are not necessarily going to rush out right away, though. I mean, in a lot of places that have reopened, they have seen a decent amount of traffic. And there's going to be certain higher costs, if not in the day-to-day costs of actual operation, just in the aggregated costs of being out of business or being in a lower amount of business for the last 3 months. And even if you're able to have some sort of takeout value, that's going to be an additional burden for what you need from sales and what you need to be sustainable. And it's not something that will be fixed overnight, even if we were able to open up to 100% capacity with 100% or 150% of the demand that we had before. So part of reassessing your working culture is just knowing that, like, as we mentioned before, there will be staff that will be feeling, or most of your staff will probably be feeling some effects of what the pandemic or even the most recent climate of talking about intersectionality, anti-racism, and racial injustice what they will be feeling. If you do this old school hospitality approach of treating labor, because it's one of your highest costs, as your primary variable cost, what you will do is you will essentially start back treating your staff as your enemy of your bottom line. It's something that a lot of people do in hospitality. It's something that a lot of us are trained to do. We're trained to like keep hours down, but many of us have never been trained to take all of our produce invoices for the last 2 months and really see where the pricing goes up and down. A lot of us haven't been trained like to even write or like call our produce supplier and mention that we noticed that they've started to put like our melon order on top of our mint, which means our mint is coming in bruised, which means that we're getting less yield, right? And like that's actually things that also save money. There are many ways to save $40 in a week in your restaurant. You can save that by cutting 2.5 hours from your dishwasher, which means that they might not be able to afford their transit pass, or you can do that by maybe reassessing some of your actual costs in other ways, or even just engaging with like how much you're paying for napkins and how much your staff are throwing out. There's a lot of ways that you can manage your costs, and if we reopen treating labor as the worst one, which I've already seen a lot of people do, that's automatically going to lead to a more contentious environment when your staff, let's be honest, are probably also going to be making less than they used to do. People deal with a lot and put up with a lot when they're busy and money's coming in and everything's good. People usually have less tolerance when they're feeling insecure in some way, especially financially insecure.
And yeah, to that, you're essentially creating efficiencies to drive success for the team, and in that, are you then considering how you might merge responsibilities in the workplace? Many hands make light load is going to be very apt in the new sort of format that these restaurants are going to offer, because to Christina's point of managing your inventory and watching where your waste goes, can you have people that can help out with jobs? Because many places are going to be operating on a bit of a leaner staff, a bit of a skeleton crew, so to speak. And so if you can have people that can do more than one job rather than just be set in one station, you'll find that the staff are going to work a lot closer together. There'll be a lot more camaraderie in that respect.
Right. So part of that is rethinking your cost. So as we kind of touched upon, what are your other variable costs? Labor isn't your only variable cost. Depending on your jurisdiction you're in, like one thing I've noticed when I started going to the States more is when you talk to bartenders in California, they are very concerned, or like a lot of those places are concerned with water, because water is much more of an expensive cost and it's limited a lot more. So people very much engage with what their water bills are like, their ice machines are like. If they're probably a lot less likely to have full ice wells that they burn at the end of the night and things like that. There's a whole range of variable costs that you can engage with, and a lot of them also have to do with waste. But it can be things like your coffee order. A lot of coffee producers have a high minimum for order, and along with the delivery fee or for something like linen, inventory fees. You can look at your invoicing and you can make a list of things that like, maybe you can afford coffee, but you can't afford the minimum. Maybe there's somebody else around you who also orders from the same supplier, so you can piggyback your orders together so that you're not paying double on top of that. With your linen delivery, maybe you don't need twice a week for linen delivery. If you're getting charged $50 for delivery, just for the delivery fee, that's money that also adds up. So rather than, again, having that contentious conversation with your dishwasher to take 2 hours away from them, taking them out of labor, out of full-time hours, perhaps you can actually engage with your other variable costs and like really assess what you need. Another thing you can do is, many people will probably be skimming from the amount of prep shifts they do and prep hours, especially because we are more of a cocktail focused seminar and conference right now. So you could actually just reassess what equipment, tools, and techniques you are doing, not just from from a labor and cost perspective. Does it take a lot of energy to do it? Does it take a lot of labor to do it? It might have a great yield, so maybe it makes up for it that way, but will you actually have that time to do? And if you take away those prep shifts, will you potentially add stress to service because it's not something that is sustainable to do on the fly, or something that is sustainable to do in the middle of a service if you actually are ending up being pretty busy, at least for your actual capacity and staffing levels. Brands. A lot of brands might come to you offering you a great rate on their premium, but that premium price with that rate still might not actually make it cheaper than what your using a rail would have done, or a different brand. It's important to not only engage with, when you're talking to the brands about what can you do for me, but also to see if you actually get value from that. Maybe it is worthwhile to use that more expensive brand with a rate that gets you down to closer to rail, because your guest preferences are such that they do really get something from having a premium. But on the converse, maybe it isn't. Maybe you would just be better off not trying to enter into these deals with brands where you also have to have objectives for them and different branding. Maybe it actually is better for you to just have a different menu for now. Maybe you would rather not get a case rate because you might not go through a lot of volume, and case rates are dependent usually on a decent amount of volume, and try to have activations as they come up, dinners as they come up, be a little bit more creative with what that might look like. And then the last two, your vendors. It's great to have longer terms with your vendors. Say, can we pay you in 30 days instead of 15? But it actually might be better to go through your invoices and see if any rates went up, especially over the last year, that could potentially go back down to your prior rate you had with them. Maybe your napkin through your linen service has gone up to 17 cents a napkin instead of 15. Maybe you notice that your lime case cost has gone up drastically. Maybe your service fee has gone up. If there's a way that you can actually lower your overall cost instead of just deferring it, because deferring your costs doesn't actually help you save money. It just helps you with cash flow. And cash flow is really important in our industry, but also just saving money will become very important going forward too. Lastly, co-op mentality, which is really looking at how you can help other businesses around you. That could be lumping your orders together. That could actually be negotiating with people as businesses together. Like, we will use you as a cleaning service once a week, and you can hit up our 3 businesses at the same time, and it'll be a lighter load. And could you give us a better rate because you're all next door? It could be helping with deliveries. It could be a whole range of things, but not every business has to be an island. And sometimes people work within their companies, but it could also just be working alongside people next door to you.
A lot of the strength of neighborhoods is largely driven by the identity of the small businesses that are cooperating with one another. You know, if you got a bunch of small businesses around one another and you're trying to work together in ways to mitigate cost, it'll also help strengthen the identity of that community and that neighborhood. You know, you're going to drive traffic down there if you've got a bunch of small businesses that are, you know, respecting and operating in a mindful manner.
Yeah. You'll want people to not only go to your place, but to ideally just buy into the idea of going out in general. If they're hitting up the whole neighborhood, that's probably better for you than if they're only going to your place and going back home. It will take a bit of time to build up back a food and drinks culture in many of our communities. So engaging with that and really working alongside each other, and that could be things like, when they're allowed, doing mini block parties, doing passport deals with neighboring bars and restaurants to try to encourage people throughout the month to go to the different spots. It could be really anything, but anything that you can use to encourage businesses around you and to limit or to help your costing with each other is something that can help you in the long run. Not just right now in the reopen, but just in general in your business. All right. And then rethinking labor variance. Okay, so one big way to actually limit your labor cost is to reassess your hours of service. Maybe you don't have to be open till 2 a.m. every day when you reopen. That was your old business model, but a lot of things are changing. Maybe it actually just makes sense to close at 12, 5 days of the week. That way you're not having that 2 to 3 hour gap where you might be busy or you might not, and you're rolling the dice. The other reason why that could be important is because it's also setting a different expectation of hours for your staff. If your staff know that they are likely going to work till 12, but if business is busy, they should be there till 3, they will have in their schedule, in their expectation of money, 5 to, and time, like say 5 p.m. to 12 is their shift. And then those extra hours between tips and or wage will be bonus. If you have them on the schedule and every day you're saying, okay, we're going to be there from 5 p.m. till 3 a.m., but you're actually aggressively cutting every shift at 12, then their expectation of hours can often go down by like 12 hours to 15 hours in a week, which over the course of a month is essentially a week's worth of pay. So part of the tension isn't necessarily that you're paying people less, it's also the expectation of what they think they're going to get, especially when they're feeling more precarious. So adjusting your hours of service could actually be a very good way to do that. Adjusting how you schedule to be much more realistic about when you cut can be a good way to do that as well. Adjusting your staffing levels for that, and then also creating more efficient programming. If you are trying to run lean, really make sure that your menus allow you to be busy while running lean. Don't necessarily assume that you're going to you'll be at 50% capacity. You'll cut your staff at half, and you'll still be able to like hit all those like good ticket times. You'll be able to scale it. You'll be able to have good service because you still want to have good service. So that might just mean that your menus change a little bit in the reopen until you have a sense of what actually it will look like. And that way you can at least protect how many hours they expect to work and their ability to actually do a good job on the shift. If you're very committed to a much more intense menu program, then I would suggest having a slightly different approach then to your labor costs in this beginning stage of reopen, so that people can actually activate that while also feeling like you're looking out for their like actual financial security and also like their mental health and all of that. I like to always say that in Canada, in our Charter of Human Rights and Freedom, one of those positive rights that we have is, and positive rights is like, there's rights that the government has to give you, and and negative rights are rights the government can't take away from you. And in Canada, we have a positive right to security of person, and that's actually been used for a lot of our social services. Obviously, you are not the federal government, but I think it can actually be very helpful to think about it sometimes as like, when I am putting together this schedule, if I'm doing this knowing I'm very much going to cut 8 hours from this person's shift, then maybe can I make this schedule that makes it more realistic to them so they know what to expect, and giving them this like feeling of security. So it's just like, it's not to say you have to give everyone 45-hour weeks the first week. It's to say that if you know you're not going to do it, then make that very clear in your communication and figure out how your structure will facilitate what you can do so everyone is on the same page. When there are arguments often at work, I use candles as an example because I think the amount of meltdowns I've seen over candles in my lifetime has been hilarious. Like the meltdowns at work are never actually about the really big issues, right? No one, like they're very rarely somebody actually having a full body like screaming match because they can't pay their bills because of whatever. They usually make it about something weird, like going into work and the napkins are folded improperly, and then just being like, this can't fucking stand, I can't deal with it. And like, part of that is because they just feel like there's a lack of control, and then it becomes about the first insignificant thing where you can control it and showcase it rather than the overall environment about why someone is now having this issue because someone didn't change the candles the night before. Right. So, and rehiring and culture, and we're almost there, guys, and we'll do questions, and I appreciate everyone. All right, so check-ins and communication. If you are the person who is in charge of checking in with your staff to rehire them, be very aware of if the last time you messaged them was when you were laying them off. That 3-month period, even if they're happy to get the call, even if you're happy to make that call, and I understand that there's a lot of stress in wanting to be able to communicate a clear timeline to people. If you if you didn't communicate for that 3 months, there will be some sort of trust gap there. It might not be an awful trust gap, but it will be there. Be aware of how quickly you jump into like all hands on deck mentality. Like, we have to do everything now. If you haven't actually done a proper check-in, do you even know if they've lost a family member in the last 3 months? We've had a higher death rate than normal globally. Do we know if something has affected them a certain way? Maybe they got their CERB check, but maybe they couldn't afford any of their pharmaceuticals that they need, because that check basically covered the base cost of living and not everything else. Maybe they are in an abusive relationship and they've just been stuck with them inside for 3 months. There's a whole lot of things that can happen with your staff and also with your guests, but especially right now with your staff. And you might not know, and you might not ever know, which means that like that whole lack of talking to someone in 3 months, just be very aware of like how you're going about it, and then what your communication looks like. Treat it like if almost they're new staff again, like how you would interact with brand new staff rather than kind of starting in your exact same dynamics before. And to that point, if you can, try to figure out what your culture was before and if it was healthy. Are you hiring back everyone because you feel like it's the right thing to do? When hiring back everyone, will that potentially reintroduce negative dynamics that were never adequately, or I guess just weren't adequately addressed before? Will that potentially now be exacerbated? Because again, we have this 3 month of who knows what happened in people's life, but we do know it's like this shared trauma, and maybe at least on one person than the other. Be very aware that like your culture was likely not perfect before. Something might need to be fixed. And even if it was perfect before, it will not be the same because you've changed so many aspects of your business. And it's also just a different time. It's always good to have a check-in. That check-in will be with yourself. And if you are able to do it in a safe way, try to have that check-in with your staff as well. Again, if you haven't had a lot of communication, don't make it that it's something that they have to volunteer to you within the first call that you gave them. Just have that as something that you'd be willing to have those conversations with going forward. And that might actually come up in a few months, where there might be tension between two staff members, and they will probably say something about how it's always been like this for months before. Also, how do you reassess your list, right? Look at who you're hiring back and think deeply about what that staff is going to look like and why, and what roles they'll be in. And also think about, are you really only bringing back management? Why is it only management? Have you checked in on your staff, including the ones that you're not rehiring? If you're only bringing back management, is it now a very white male, straight environment? Or what does it actually look like? And what are you perpetuating through creating this list? Always be aware that just because someone isn't in a role that is more fixed to financial benchmarks, which often management is, like a manager can say, while I was here, sales went up 15% and costs went down 5%. Your bar back can't. Be very aware of if you're hiring back people because they were already in power dynamic roles where they can showcase their worth in terms of numbers, instead of also showcasing their worth in terms of the amount of years that they've been there and the actual work that they do, especially if you're still going to need that role. Being transparent with all your staff is really important, and not just the ones that are rehired. The amount of people who found out that their places are reopening or doing takeout because they saw it on Instagram is gut-wrenching, right? You owe it to everyone that you worked with to have that conversation. And sometimes that might be a really hard conversation where you have to tell someone, even if we rehire back most people, we're not rehiring you because we don't think that that would lend to like a healthy environment, because there was a lot of issues, like say there's a lot of like issues around toxicity or however you have to word it. Don't just think that they are not waiting for you and just think that like if you don't look at the problem, it will go away. That's something that we can often do in hospitality, and it's something that is incredibly damaging and often a function of being manipulative or abusive. If you're not going to hire back somebody, tell them. You need to tell them so that they try to get a job in a shrunken job market. And that might mean that they're not going to be happy with you. And that is something you're going to have to eat because that's part of your role as a manager or owner. And it's unfortunate and it is hard, especially for those of you with large teams, or even not with large teams. But I'm saying large teams if you have to have that conversation over and over again. But at least here, I'm seeing these large hospitality groups with lots of staff, and every staff member thinks they're coming back. And you can crunch the numbers and you're like, there's no way that all of your staff are coming back. There's no way you have jobs for them. Those people are owed a conversation, at least about the likelihood of their jobs, so that they can make decisions as people, and they are people with their own lives. They're not just your staff, they're people with their own responsibilities, so that them as adults with their own responsibilities can then make decisions that make sense for them. And even more, you could say, we can hire you back. It will be for 15 hours and only Friday and Saturday. And you have to have that conversation so that people can maybe make the decision that yes, that is okay. They can actually get a second job somewhere, or no, that isn't okay. They have to start actively looking for something else.
This leads into a great question that Chris Thibodeau had. And the question was, how do you advise people what to do financially? You know, many people are on EI or CERB and potentially going back to work for less money. And, you know, so his point is that it's a bit of a gamble for people, at least initially. I think that the bigger gamble is not willing to go back to work, right? This is a reconfiguration of what we need in our time and our space. You know, I'm an extreme extrovert, and having 3 months in my home with my wife was phenomenal. But I started to notice in those first few days back, it's like, holy shit, there's a lot of energy out here. Like it, you know, you have to reconfigure that. More importantly for staff, you know, there were a number of homies of mine who have bars and restaurants who said that their staff just opted out of working in any capacity so that they could claim EI or CRB. Immediately, that staff is not on the team anymore, right? They're making a decision to just collect EI or CRB because it, you know, maybe you don't want to work 50 hours a week. You want to work no time at all and make 70% of that pay. That's appealing. That, I mean, we can all understand how, you know, it makes sense to not have to work your ass off for this through this pandemic and still be able to get some supplemental income. But you have to be very mindful about what that looks like for your job prospects moving forward. Are you someone that opted out of working so that you can get an EI check? Are you someone that committed to the project and got back to work even though you're only making a little bit more? And I think that the strength of those relationships is largely going to be driven by people who are willing to commit to going back to work.
But a big part of that too is be very aware that if people are cutting short their CRB or EI, that is why you have to be very transparent with the hours that they can expect. Until CRB is done, for many people, they have until they can make $1,000 as additional income, right? So a lot of places have hired back their staff and they've essentially capped the income that they're getting at $1,000 a month. And that's been very helpful. When it is all ended, or when it does end, just be aware, like if your ask is, I will not guarantee you any hours consistently, I will cut you without letting you know, and it will be a max of 20 hours a week, and you have to completely go off CRB, like that is not a compelling reason for people to put themselves in financial jeopardy, right? Like be very aware of what your ask looks like. And that's part of being transparent and understanding that people are able to make their own decisions, just like you're able to make their decisions. People don't want to go back to work for you in general, that's fine. But if your ask was, I will not guarantee you any hours or pay, because it'll be completely dependent on how much business is being made, but very likely based on how I'm going to schedule you, you'll make $1,300 this month. That's not actually compelling enough for someone to go off of CRB because they're not going to be secure. So just be very aware that it's also not like you're on the team or you're not, your family or you're not. Using family language is a way to be manipulative often, because families can be very abusive, right? Like we put up with a lot of shit from our parents. We put up with a lot of shit from our siblings and our cousins that we would never take from someone in a professional standpoint. So when you keep being like, we're family, like, it's like, that doesn't actually mean that we're healthy.
Mm-hmm.
That just is using a dynamic that shouldn't actually exist. But yeah, transparency will give people autonomy. Letting people have autonomy is good. Treating your staff like they are adults with separate lives that they don't necessarily even have to disclose to you is also important. And understanding that, like, yes, if they are like, I don't want to come back to work, great. You don't necessarily have to hold a space for them, but also get, like, what did you even ask them and what did you tell them? And if you're not giving them full information because you're afraid of having hard conversations, then that is something you need to examine as a manager, because you're not managing that situation properly and providing solid leadership that somebody can trust. I have to trust you to be honest with me, and then I have to make decisions for myself as an adult.
Creating a safe space. Personal finance is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people, and understandably so. It's largely related to lifestyle and well-being, and creating that safe space for your staff to be able to come to you to have those discussions is going to be paramount to that identity.
Yeah,
I think it's important to note too, like we see it in our industry a lot, those cultures that, and those bars that you walk into that you know right away, this is a tight team, they've got their shit together, they care about each other. How are they leaning into these conversations? What's the cadence of their meetings looking like? Increasing that cadence. And even if you don't have the answers, letting them know that we don't have the answers yet, but what is this going to look like for you? And putting that, pivoting certain roles. If it's somebody that's typically been a server for you, maybe they could now be a delivery agent, maybe some way that you can help put money in their pocket. And then on the other side of the coin is those people that are here that aren't managers and they work in the industry and they aren't getting this kind of conversation and this transparency is knowing what you're entitled to and not being afraid to ask for it. Not being able to get commitment from your employer on, I'm getting I'm getting CERB and I'd like to be able to be paid $900 and work for those because I want to help out. And then the other thing too is, like, if you're a part of one of these groups that it does feel like a healthy commitment and family and you want to get back to them, maybe offering to be around and work on things that aren't necessarily super labor intensive, but to just keep a good pulse on what your establishment is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can also be a part of those conversations to help change going forward, or just be a part of it. Those are just some things that came to my mind out of what you guys been talking about.
And not all the gains that people make need to be financial to feel like you're succeeding, right? Contributing to something is such an integral part of mental health, and feeling like you're a part of that community that is striving towards goals will have dividends in the end that are a little less tangible at the moment because finances are top mind.
All right, and then this is our last slide. Thank you. I know it's kind of dry, but management and leadership talks are always a little bit drier. And then it'll be questions and answers and discussion. So we're actually pretty close to on time, which, yay. All right, so training and onboarding. In the bar industry and hospitality, we are very bad at this, like notoriously bad at this, doing it in a sustainable way. But as kind of mentioned in the first bit, think about this closer to an opening of a restaurant than a reopening of a restaurant, because so many things will be changed. And as such, you're going to have job descriptions. A lot of people have issued job descriptions in the past, partly because that way you can just kind of change it on your staff as it goes on. That is not good, because a lot of arguments and tensions at work happen from people expecting a job to be done by someone and that person not getting that is part of their job description. If you now want the bartenders to greet people and take their number when they come in, put that as part of their job description. Tell them before you want that to happen. If you have new cleaning and breaking down mechanisms, let people know that. If you do not bring back a dishwasher, so everyone needs to do that. Like, I worked in a actually really nice restaurant where we never really had a dishwasher, and we all kind of took turns throughout service and helped out the kitchen at the end. It's actually fine when you're told that. If you're not told to expect that, it's awful, right? Because you just don't work the same way. Having a job description for everyone before you are asking them to come back to work will be very helpful to avoid tensions in service, and will also be very helpful to have, if something seems too much or unrealistic, you want to have that conversation with your staff before it becomes a problem. You want to have that conversation earlier on, and informed consent and active consent. We often use consent in terms of sex. Consent actually is just your life, right? It has to do with contracts. It has to do with everything. Having people affirmatively consent to what they're going to be doing means that they understand what you expect, and then you can hold them to a higher standard. If they feel like you're constantly adding new things to their work plate, whether or not it is completely fair or realistic to do is besides the point if you haven't communicated that of your own volition beforehand and had a conversation. And most people will agree to everything before, but they only really push back because they feel like they haven't been kept in the loop. So even just taking the time and looking at your different positions that you have and just analyzing if some people might have increased work functions. That could even be for you as a bar manager. Like maybe now you have to do the social media. You should get that added to your job description. Like just if that is what is expected of you. If they like laid off the person who does the social media, all of those things are very important to know, because you don't want, say in 2 months, you're running on bare bones and then ownership is upset that there hasn't been a new social media post in 3 days. And you're like, when am I supposed to do this? When I thought I was just helping out for the first week, I didn't realize you wanted this as part of my job. These conversations are good to avoid tensions in the future, and also just good to keep morale high. Pay rates, a lot of people will not be able to increase pay rates, but this is just something to consider, that if you know that you're going to have drastically lower hours, if you know that you have $400 that you can pay somebody, but not a ton of hours, you might be able to increase the pay rate a bit, knowing that the hours will go down. That can be a hard conversation. I'm not saying you're necessarily going to be able to do that, but it's something just to keep in mind. Maybe just looking at your overall labor budget and how that fits into your brand new business model, given your new hours of service and or offerings, and then what that might look like, especially if people are not making tips as much, or if you're pivoting to a model more of takeout. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that tips have gone down if you've been doing takeout, especially through a lot of the apps. So it might not be realistic to do a server's wage and expect tips when you're not really getting tips coming in. We're also not, if people are doing takeout, they're not getting the same level of service that we usually use to justify getting tips, right? So if they're not getting that interaction, they might not feel like they need to do it. And also they might not have the same amount of money as they had before. So people might not be as generous with that money. Language, policy, and discretion. Be very aware of, in the training and onboarding, and we're going to talk about this a bit more next week because this goes more into the first few days, of the language you use when you talk about policy and how much autonomy or discretion you allow people to use. So I'm going to use one example. Next week we'll have more, but one will be masks. Masks are necessary and mandated in, I guess, all the regions right now for food and drinks. A lot of people, especially if they have a history with sexual assault or violence, or even just certain traumatic happenings, or just respiratory issues, find wearing masks hard to traumatic. It's also something that a lot of people will not disclose to you, depending on your relationship with them. That is not to say they don't have to wear a mask, but what that is to say is masks are something that maybe you can allow some discretion on because the actual laws don't mandate it has to be a certain kind. So what a lot of proactive managers would do would be like, I want to get masks. Masks are expensive. I went on Alibaba. I bought 1,000 of the blue surgical masks. We have masks. This is what people have to wear. It's done. It's done. And then not understanding maybe why, taking like the hesitance from a staff member about that mask as necessarily being that staff member not wanting to be a team member, and maybe not getting that there might be actual other issues at play. There's a lot of really good tutorials online about how to turn socks into masks, especially in Korea. They did in their reopening. It's cost effective. You can choose the material. And by choosing the material and the weight of the material, it can also help people especially if they're people who get anxiety or might have reasons why they're more sensitive to their face being covered. You could probably always still do guidelines on the look if you have issues with uniform. But it's something where you can already put in that guideline, understanding that a lot of people might not disclose that to you, and getting rid of like some of those issues before. And it's really just thinking about assuming that a lot of people might have trauma, not making them have to disclose it to you for it to actually be a policy. And then being aware sometimes in the way that you're going to say some of these policies and language, use language around it, finding ways to see if you're just being like, you have to listen to me, I'm the manager, and try to make sure that like you're being inclusive of what could actually make people feel safe in different ways. And I mentioned the mask one because that is something that a lot of survivors of domestic violence or sexual violence would not feel comfortable disclosing to a boss, a manager, but giving just anyone the ability to choose what is comfortable on their face, because it's going to be uncomfortable wearing a mask anyway. When you're serving people, is something that could actually like help in the long term, and is you centering the experiences of your staff in a way that is healthy. The last thing, and again, we'll talk about it more next week, is scripts and tools. Be very ready to have things not go smoothly, so that you'll have scripts and tools available to your staff and for yourself, so that you can de-escalate, you can help with guest management and what have you. Not everything should be done on the fly, and you do yourself a disservice when you treat everything like a pop-up. If you know that issues can arise, name them, talk to your staff, be like, how do we handle this? What do we do? Even something like kicking out somebody when you're not supposed to touch people. How do you kick out somebody who is being boisterous and or violent? Like, what does it do to your security I mean, nightclubs aren't a thing, but if you still work somewhere that is going to be a bit more fun, how do you actually have conversations with your security staff about what you want them to do with their physical bodies, their physicality, now that we have physical distancing issues? If you're somewhere that can still be relatively high volume, whatever that might look like, how do you communicate to your busing staff, if you have busing staff that just take up glassware, the amount of like saliva and everything they're getting in contact with? How do you communicate to them so that they feel safe, right? And if a guest is definitely escalating in a certain way, what does that look like now that we have all these rules about distancing and engagement, and how do we make everyone feel like they are able to actually manage that situation? So this is just like pre-open, you need to have some of these scripts and tools and conversations ready. They will look different based on your spot. They'll look different based on the staff that you have. And they'll look different also based on like who you are and how you are as a manager in those situations, and how you delegate in those situations too. But these are all things, and I know it can almost be exhausting, but are very important to think about in the training and onboarding of our old staff and our new staff. And also remember, some of you might still have to find new staff in your reopen, because maybe some of your staff moved away, or they're not coming back, or there's other issues involved. All right, Kevin? Feeling good? Good, all right, we did it. So stop and share so I can see everyone's lovely faces. Yeah, so now it's just any questions, comments you may have. There's probably some in the chat. I've been talking, so I'm in there, but I know, John, did you want to flag anything in the chat?
I had asked everyone to hold tight and wait for now for questions. So please, by all means, ask away. Two other points, and I just wanted to make while we're at it. And as a journalism major, I can tell you this: in the way that we consume media, oftentimes a media outlet will try and race to break a story, and that story may not be 100% accurate. And we've seen that a little bit with some of the changes in legislation where they haven't actually been clear. And then what happens is, especially if it's a credible news place like the Globe and Mail, for example, other news outlets will see that and they'll just copy and paste that story, and that's how that momentum starts. So it's a really important to actually stop and bear down and actually look at the article and see whether that happens, because in Canada for media law, you actually have to prove that you're trying to be libelous, and no one's ever trying to prove, or no one's ever being libelous, and they're not actually doing that. So we've seen that a lot more over the last couple of months. A perfect example of that was with some of the liquor pricing changes or liquor law changes. So I thought I'd just throw that one out there. But yeah, if anyone else has any questions, please It was very comprehensive. I feel like every time there was a question that I was thinking in my head, you answered it in the next slide. So
Yeah. Yeah, like, I mean, if you have any questions, and then I think we're going to put this on YouTube as well, going in. I know it's very heavy. I appreciate everyone staying on board for the whole time. And next week I'll recap a bit of it in case people come and they don't want to watch this again or you forget. But next week we'll talk a little bit more about the first few days, and there will be a pretty heavy amount on conflict de-escalation, safe spaces, and ways to center that. I do think, and again, if people have questions, if you want to put them in the chat, because I just can't see everybody if you were to wave. But I think if we were to rethink a lot of our policies as policies that are based in like preemptive empathy, and policies that are based in centering like security of people and also people's feelings of security, we would actually have a lot of healthier workplaces. And that doesn't actually have to go against how you run your business. None of that actually has to do with your bottom line. It's a myth that we're told from when we were all as employees paid very, very little and treated like servants, that if we care about workers, then we won't make money. That's just not true. And it's not true because other industries don't work that way and don't have the same combative approach to labor. And we can ask for more for ourselves, and we can want more for ourselves as well.
Yeah, Christina, you did a seminar here at Drink Atlantic last year about safe and inclusive workspaces, and it made me think about, when I saw the pandemic happen, and I immediately saw grocery stores stopped using paper bags, and they went back to plastic, or we would see, environmental impacts or things that were at the forefront for us before the pandemic kind of go to the wayside in order to reopen quickly, or to rush this process, or to not put the right thought in. And I think that it's really important, to your point, to continue these things. And we have an opportunity now, when this whole industry is kind of shut down, to rethink and to be leaders, because there are no answers. It's an okay time to take a risk. And that risk can involve the things that we've been trying to change in this industry. For example, in Nova Scotia, we have a very limited amount of people of color behind the bar. We have very limited amount of Black people coming to cocktail bars in Halifax. What are some ways we can start to rethink how we reopen our doors so that we can get not less white people, but more of every, color coming in and enjoying themselves, and seeing that this is a viable trade?
Mm-hmm. If your place is appealing to a small demographic of people, you have already limited your earning potential. And if you've decided that the only reason why it's appealing to a small demographic of people has nothing to do with your internal culture or your marketing or anything, it's just that only a small group of people can get it, then you've already kind of decided that you don't want to develop as a business or grow. It's very, it is in Halifax, but it's also in Toronto as well. If you look at the more West End cool kid places, they're very white, and they're very straight and white. But the actual demographics, even of a lot of the people who go to those places, aren't. And it's very fascinating that the staff is so not reflective of a lot of the communities that they're in. And that only can't help you. I did a thing with Sean Sewell a couple days ago, and I was talking about sports bars. And it's if you're staffing your sports bar, you wouldn't only have people who understand football, even though you think that football is one of your best day, right? On Sunday and on Monday, that you think. You would never just get people who only understand that sport, because that's not the only sport that you offer, and that doesn't make sense as a sports bar. You'd still get people who understand golf. You'd get people who understand soccer, baseball, who might understand darts, whatever it might be, because it actually just makes sense. We talk a lot about wanting to interact with people, and one thing that I noticed when I was more of a hiring manager, my staff always just looked very different. It was never something that I thought about as a checklist, but I'm also a woman and a person of color. And I think maybe I just and my mind, I don't have to be as convinced about some people's experience or what have you, which is a whole other loaded conversation. Because I never had to think about that much, and every time I had to hire staff, my staff just looked like Toronto. But I'd leave places, and then there'd be a new hiring manager, and then all of a sudden become like skinny white boys, like working, and the staff would slowly change over. But having a lot of people from different backgrounds is also just good for like conflict de-escalation. Not everyone has the same tolerance for the same attitudes. And that's not even like a race thing. I'm just saying like as personalities. Like some people are very used to interacting in a certain way, and maybe you use a type of language, maybe you're from a certain like town, and other people are different. Like some people are very extroverted, some people are introverted. It's like when you're on the bar with somebody else, and sometimes people like to have bar partners that are very different from them, because then you can play off each other for like who you're actually serving. That's the same thing, but even bigger when you're thinking about what your staff actually looks like. If your staff have a broader range of personalities that they can still use to like help with your work culture, they will appeal to more people, and more people will feel comfortable in your space. If your work culture is so narrowly defined that you essentially have 6 different bodies with the same personality and the same interests, how are you going to have a lot of guests that like that? You've really just curated it for a very small amount of people. And there are countless studies about diversity and a wealth of experiences actually helping you make money. But especially when you are in a business that is still so reliant on the personalities of its frontline workers, like in front of house especially, it would make sense that you should just have a variety of people and a variety of work experiences, because that will appeal to more guests and more people. And more people are likely to come in and feel comfortable that first or second time and actually see themselves in that space. Like when I work places, more like people of color tend to come in because a lot of them don't feel welcome in spaces, right? Like, so it's just like, I'm not saying hire a Black person so Black people come in, but also if you hire a Black person, Black people will probably come in more. Like it's actually just fact, because they're not coming in because they don't like a cocktail or they don't like your food. They probably are coming in because they think they won't be welcome because they've had a lot of experiences where they're not welcome. I used to love going, when I worked at, like 10 years ago, I worked at this place called Lee, and I was like a very keen little baby manager and like baby wannabe som and whatever. And none of my friends had money because I was young. And our manager at the time actually gave a pretty good piece of advice, which was like, I mean, he would always yell at us because he was one of the most abusive people in Canada, but he would be like, none of you can sell shit because none of you know what it's like to go out and have a good time. And I was like, none of you know what it's like to actually order an $80 bottle of wine or more and to like create these experiences for yourself, because you don't do it, so you feel weird about selling it. There's probably better ways he could have put it, but a lot of us started going out either with each other or by ourselves on our days off to like have the experience. And I would go to places, nice places by myself, and often just get ignored. And often ask a question about the wine because I was curious about it and I knew about it, but that question I would be treated like an idiot or like I didn't know. I'm just asking about the vintage because I heard somebody say that, not because I actually know about the vintage. And it actually made me like in a sick way going to certain places, because it wasn't strictly a nice place versus a bad place, or like often the more hipster places were worse to me than like the old school fine dining, because I think old school fine dining, you're often taught to just eat it and like deal with anyone anyway. And so it's probably not as weird to see like a young person dressed up by themselves, like spending money. Maybe they thought I was a prostitute, who knows? But like, it was just something that as people started to know me more in Toronto, I don't get that experience by myself as much, but I see that experience still happen with people. And I know what it's like to be ignored, and I know what it's like to just avoid going to places because you just don't, if you're spending money and you're trying to have a good time, that level of tension is not something that you want to like spend your money on. And this Friday, Great Goose, Steph and I are going to do an IG Live. It's Juneteenth, which is the US Emancipation Day. So not a Canadian holiday, but it's also Martini Day. So we're going to have martinis. And we are going to, part of what our discussion will be is just like how in Canadian hospitality, we can rethink racism is not something that like people bring into your spaces as guests, but things that can like live in your space and what that looks like. And it often isn't the violence that people want it to be. It's not the very aggressive like N-word or like, I don't want Chinese people bringing this over, I think they have COVID. It's sometimes that happens, but it's usually like this like softer, polite, pervasive racism, because we're in Canada, so everything's softer, polite, and pervasive. So we'll be doing that, and it's a giant conversation our industry needs to have. But it is something that I think will be good for all of us in the future, especially just for our bottom line, for sales. Well, and there's a lot of good stuff in the chat if people didn't see them.
John, I think a lot of them were either answered in the conversation, and some were just answered by John. Are we missing anybody, John?
Yeah, it was a lot of people agreeing with everything that you and Kevin said. So yeah, it's that's great. Yeah, no, there was just a couple technical ones that I answered, but yeah, I think Kevin, do you want to talk about the CPB Relief Measures Fund, because today's the last day?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly, you know,
Yeah.
like in that everyone is going to be slowly getting back into work. There are still resources available to bartenders across Canada with the CPBA's Relief Measure Fund. If you get an application in and you are a member, you're essentially available to receive some money. And then the Bartenders Benevolent Fund has, you know, their Monday deadline coming up. So there's still some money available. So it might not be you specifically, but surely you know that there are people who work in this industry who are kind of getting a little bit tight and stressed for cash. And so just making sure that they know that there are resources available to help support through these last, hopefully, few weeks of this pandemic. You know, it would be incredible if we could all get back to work sooner than later, not just for financial, but for the mental health. So those things are available to bartenders in Canada.
Yeah, and thank you for all of the work that the CPBA, the Bartenders Benevolent Fund, and everybody that has been rising to the occasion to help people out. I know that there's also been a lot of these kind of seminars available to people, and we appreciate that you took your Sunday to spend with us. We are going to be doing this every Saturday and Sunday until July 5th. We also have another special seminar that's going to be happening tomorrow. And Evan, did you want to chat to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the Sovereign Canada is doing a spirited session tomorrow, kind of in light of Drink Atlantic. So we're kind of taking it to two Haligonians to walk us through the history of trade, taverns, and temperance. So I think most people, I kind of saw most people on this conversation are from Canada. If you're a bartender in Canada, you've probably at least heard the name Shane Behan before, if not met him, and listen to his poetic ways of speaking. He's going to host us, and we're going to have Emily Burton, who's a PhD graduate from Dalhousie here in Canadian history. Part of her work was to study Atlantic alcohol trade and the first tavern set up in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the 1700s to 1800s. And then we're going to have Shane kind of walk us through more modern times. Shane just texted me and said they just had a 2-hour meeting walking through what they're going to talk about tomorrow, and he's really excited about it. I'm very excited about it. We got a little preview as well, and there's going to be some really cool things. We're going to touch on even kind of like places like North Preston, which is one of the largest Black communities in Canada, and talk about kind of celebrate some of the first Black bar owners in Nova Scotia. So it should be a lot of fun. That's tomorrow at 2. And there's the ID, and I can put the link in the chat too to register. So yeah, we'll hopefully see you guys tomorrow. Oh, also, sorry. It's also, we're gonna do something different for the last few sessions. We've been donating to the Bartenders Benevolent Fund and the CPA Relief Measures Fund. We thought we'd kind of switch the contribution and do 3 different charities. That's going to be Black Health Alliance, Egale Canada, and the Native Women's Association of Canada. And we're going to give a base donation, and then $5, whoever would like us to donate on their behalf, we'll do that as well. So come on and attend. hope to see you there.
Awesome. And I know people can be shy, so if you have anything, and it was really dense, so it will be online, but if you have a question that comes up, or even just something you want to discuss, maybe something that I said or Kevin said that was particularly whack, always feel free to DM or email. I think it should be through, like, it'll be on the website, and I'm active on social media. Give me some time if it's, sometimes I get a lot of messages, but it's something that I do think is really important, and it's something that I hope that if you took the time today, you can like really embody and use some, if not everything that was used, and help make all of our spaces like a little bit more empathic and guide along. So I appreciate you. Don't feel any ways about reaching out or sharing it with your friends or what have you.
I think I called Christina last week and she was like, sorry, I just got off of my 5th call on similar topics. So she totally is available to help you through all kinds of, or just have chats. So I think it's really important. And I mean, just to echo, Julia Lewis here just said to thank you for everyone. I know here in New York, outdoor dining was moved from phase 3 to phase 2 with very little notice. So many places I have seen rush their reopening plans in a way that does not protect or prioritize workers. Good to see and hear that from people who are thinking of another way. And I think, Christina and Kevin, you guys are leaders in this sort of empathetic way of leading and being great leaders in Canada and international as well. So let's all be leaders as we move forward as bar managers together, and don't be afraid to lean on each other from coast to coast. Mm-hmm. If there's no other questions, any last words from you folks?
Well, I mean, thank you, Christina, for inviting me to participate and support you in this seminar. This is awesome. And, Jeff, Matt, Evan, you guys out east, keep up the good work. This is awesome, and to your point, we are all here to support one another, and everybody's experiences are different. So don't ever hesitate. As Christina said, I'm always here. If you have questions regarding anything, I'm going to do my best to get back to you as quick as I can, because I'm here to help. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for sharing your Sunday, folks. Next week, so tomorrow and next week, all kinds of free, great information. Love you all. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
You were on time. That's awesome. Yeah.